Good afternoon, everyone. We're here this afternoon to honor the prophetic work of Dr. Mark Ellis by engaging that work as colleagues, scholars, and fellow citizens. And in that spirit of engagement, I ask you to explore with me the particular challenges that Ellis's work poses for those of us who are members of the professional managerial class and professors and educators of the professional managerial class. Now, as you know, beginning in the late 19th century and continuing into the 21st century, the professional managerial class has played a distinct role in capitalist societies. We are neither the primary owners of the means of production, nor the workers who produce goods directly. Rather, as managers in corporate and civil life, as healthcare workers, as teachers, attorneys, and professors, we are the agents of social order. This may be a social order based on social control, and hence be accompanied by relationships of either deference or hostility with the working class. Or we may be in solidarity with the working class, agents of a social order based on justice, equity, and compassion. As we engage in the work of solidary service, the voice of the prophet is essential. The voice that opens our hearts and minds to the complex realities of our world, realities that are often hidden and masked. To quote Dr. Ellis, "The prophet is one who encounters history and God on behalf of the broken, the widow, the orphan, the poor, and the stranger, and draws us to them. The prophetic is about real people who have been cast aside the walls of society or imprisoned within them," end quote. Ellis articulates the powerful call of the prophetic and invites us to work together, and I quote, "self-critical secular and self-critical religious thinkers in new and revolutionary solidarity with all peoples of conscience." Now, Ellis's invitation to us is compelling, and I'm going to take up one dimension of that challenge this afternoon for our work as professors and educators. Let us begin by recalling not only the depth and persistence of the prophetic, but the power and resilience of state and corporate-sponsored cruelty, coercion, and exploitation. The words again of Dr. Ellis. As the path beyond barbarism is explored, what will happen to those millions upon millions of people who live on the edge of destruction, those reduced to destitution, and those future victims of atrocity? How will they organize their own defense? And how will those who seek to help in that defense gain moral and political strength to wage the war for human dignity and survival? In the face of this challenge, our guiding insights, elucidation through abundance, the truth that comes to us by accident from strangers, the place of silence and hospitality seem humble and individual. How do these understandings become organized to confront injustice and atrocity? Or will their organization lead us back into the very cycle of militarization from which we are trying to escape? Now, Ellis also reminds us of a core dynamic of cycles of atrocity, complicity, and hypocrisy, the pretense of innocence on the part of the purveyors of violence. Now, let's think about this more deeply. How is it that we as oppressors become convinced of our innocence, holding that innocence no longer as a pretense, but as a foundational conviction, one unswayed by the reality of death and oppression? To understand this mechanism as members of the professional managerial class, to teach this mechanism is one step in challenging its power, one step in freeing ourselves and others from its pernicious logic. I discovered the power of teaching students about the mask of innocence, the structures of administrative evil, and the role of morality in the perpetuation of inhumanities quite by accident. Spring 2004, weeks before the release of the photographs of Abu Ghraib and the disclosure of the horrific torture of Iraqis by United States and British forces, I was teaching a class on religious perspectives on peace and war at the University of Missouri. Now, this was, in many ways, a stealth class. It was listed only as contemporary issues in religious studies and attracted a student body looking for a general humanities credit. As a result, the students reflected the general population of Missouri. 80% considered themselves to be conservative, 10% considered themselves to be very conservative, and only 10% thought of themselves as moderate or liberal. Most of the students also had family members who had a long history of military service, including service in the ongoing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. When the news was released in late April of the outrageous acts of torture and sexual humiliation, these conservative students were appalled and horrified. They immediately and readily saw these actions as violating all codes of military honor and human decency, and shared wholeheartedly the sentiments expressed by the British Prime Minister Tony Blair, quote, "Let me make it quite clear that if these things have actually been done, they are completely and totally unacceptable. We went to Iraq to get rid of that sort of thing, not to do it ourselves." Now, given that these very conservative students saw the injustice for what it was, I was quite shocked to discover that their reaction was unique, and that far from being appalled, leaders in the Bush administration dismissed such actions as aberrations and went on to even defend the use of torture. Now, what made the difference between the responses of conservative students in mid-Missouri and conservative citizens and governmental leaders throughout the United States? In the week prior to the revelations of torture at Abu Ghraib, we had read two essays: William Schultz, Security as a Human Right Too, and Albert Bandura, Moral Disengagement and Perpetuation of Inhumanities. In his essay, Schultz, then director of Amnesty International, made the claim that it is equally important to condemn human rights violations in the name of preventing terrorism as it is to denounce terrorism itself. He stated, "We have chastised one government after another for using terrorism as an excuse to muzzle peaceful dissent. We have criticized the United States for its arbitrary roundup of Arab and Muslim residents, for the incommunicado detention of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay in defiance of the Geneva Conventions." Then, in addition to these legitimate criticisms of governmental actions, he also spoke of the ways in which the human rights community could combat terrorism, which itself was a violation of human rights. He thought that it was important for members of the human rights community to, and I quote, "name the suppliers of arms to terrorist groups. Suppliers who include established states, not just rogue ones. Mobilize grassroots opposition to terrorism by addressing root causes, like economic deprivation or social discrimination." And he ended his essay with a quotation from Stephen Spender, an opponent of the fascists during the Spanish Civil War, and I quote, "When I saw photographs of children murdered by the fascists, I felt furious pity. When the supporters of Franco talked of red atrocities, I merely felt indignant that people should tell such lies. In the first case, I saw corpses. In the second, only words. I gradually acquired a certain horror of the way in which my own mind worked. It was clear to me that unless I cared about every murdered child impartially, I did not really care about children being murdered at all." Now, the power of Spender's poetic self-disclosure was augmented by the careful arguments of the social psychologist Albert Bandura. Bandura described how easy it is for moral clarity and absolutism to lead to cruelty and violence, and he delineated 7 practices of moral disengagement, ways genuinely decent human beings commit and justify behaviors that they would otherwise recognize as morally abhorrent. The practices are clear, and examples readily came to mind. The first, First practice is being convinced that one is the bearer of a just cause, and I quote Bandura, fighting ruthless oppressors, protecting cherished values, preserving world peace, saving humanity from subjugation, or honoring their country's commitments. The second practice, avoiding the negative consequences of one's behavior through the use of euphemistic language, the term collateral damage for the death and injuries caused to civilians, or the terms professional interrogation techniques for physical and psychological torture. A third practice, advantageous comparison. Our violence pales in comparison to theirs. Recall Alberto Gonzalez's response when he was challenged by Senator Lindsey Graham to decisively condemn the use of torture by United States personnel. Quote, while we are struggling to find out what happened at Abu Ghraib, they're beheading people like Danny Pearl and Nick Berg. We are nothing like our enemy. The fourth and fifth practices, the diffusion and displacement of responsibility. For subordinates, one claims to have only been following orders. For those in charge, orders to commit atrocities are most often implicit rather than direct, and officials dismiss harmful actions as those of a few irresponsible personnel who are either misguided or overzealous. In the case of Abu Ghraib, the early outrage of Tony Blair was quickly supplanted by a displacement of responsibility and what were seen as a few ill-trained and misguided soldiers, and the policy decisions of government officials that not only fostered such abuses has yet to be thoroughly and independently investigated. Sixth practice, disregard or distortion of consequences. If euphemistic language no longer works, the evidence of harm can be discredited. And then finally, when the severity of the consequences can no longer be avoided, one dehumanizes or demonizes the victim. They're all terrorists, or they all share an irrational hatred of us. Now, these processes of moral disengagement are pervasive and extremely hard to dislodge once in place. It is, however, possible to inoculate people against these practices. As in the case of conservative students in Missouri, early warnings served to heighten moral intelligence. With this preparation, students could easily see the operation of moral justification in the rhetoric of government officials, and were singularly unpersuaded by their legitimacy or morality. Now, a final point. Guy Adams and Danny Balfour are professors of public affairs and nonprofit administration who have taken this principle of inoculation even further. They argue that the practice of professional ethics, with its attention to efficiency, effectiveness, accountability, and productivity, must be amplified by a rigorous awareness of and safeguards against administrative evil. The processes by which actions that cause great harm to other people and to the environment are masked by the daily practices, quote, of ordinary people acting appropriately in their organizational role. Balfour and Adams advocate for a new form of professional ethics infused with historical consciousness and claim that we can recognize the mask of administrative evil and refuse to act as accomplices, end quote. They examine the role that administrative evil played in the implementation of the Nazi Holocaust, the Challenger shuttle disaster, and the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. They argue that our task as professionals is twofold: learning how to recognize administrative evil as it occurs within our organizations, and secondly, establishing ongoing safeguards against it. Now, while well received within the discipline, the work laid out by Adams and Balfour has just begun. When individuals encounter administrative evil, they may protest or resign. But what else might we do? What are more powerful ways of bringing such awareness to the normal practices of professional attention, vigilance, and oversight within corporate and governmental responsibility? As we continue this unfinished task, two things are clear. We may do this work in the light of the challenge that Ellis finds in the work of Hannah Arendt, a rigorous and self-critical participation in, quote, a consciously planned beginning of history, end quote. And we may do so in service of the ideals upheld by Ellis, a new and revolutionary solidarity with all peoples of conscience. Thank you.